This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at the third and final ink from my Ferris wheel press ink charger set, Grape Ice Pop. The 5 milliliter sample of Grape Ice Pop comes in a glass sample vial, and the 3 sample vials come in a magnetically closed, pretty heavy duty box. Now, the opening of these sample vials, I've mentioned in a previous video, is pretty small, and most of the pens that I try to use with this ink don't fit in the opening of the vial, like number 6 size nibs, even Pilot number 5 size nibs. The gold nibs don't fit, platinum nibs don't fit. So with each of these samples, I poured them into a more commonly used sample vial. And the second ink that I tested, Lady Rose, was a very watery but dry ink, and I had trouble, took some effort to get the ink to come out of the Ferris wheel press glass vial and get it into the sample vial. But this Grape Ice Pop is pretty wet and flowy, and I was able to get it into the sample vial fairly easily. I'm going to do a writing sample with Grape Ice Pop on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper, and then I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did previously on copy paper. I'll show some inks from my collection that are comparable to Grape Ice Pop, and finally I'll show the results of my water resistance test. Ferris wheel press Grape Ice Pop came off the nib of my glass dip pen initially very quickly. Then it kind of evened out and became very pleasant to write with. The swatch that I made with my tweezers on Tomoe River paper held onto the paper and made a nice crisp swatch. The swatch ranged from a dark raisin color purple to a medium. There's no sheen in the drip at the end of the swatch. I'm going to begin with a Conklin mini graph. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. I've had issues with this nib in the past. In fact, when I first got this pen, the feed was very off-center and the tines were severely misaligned. So I straightened up the tines and I smoothed it out a bit. It writes decently well now, but it's not, I wouldn't call it enjoyable to write with. I do like the way this ink is performing with it. I may just need to do a little more flattening out of the nib. It feels a little wonky, a little lopsided, but I'm gonna say with this ink it writes nicely. Next I've got a Sailor Pro Gear Slim. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This is very nice. On this Tomoe River paper, this Sailor fine nib just performs very well. And in these tight grids, it's just very easy to write small with this fine nib. There is some feedback, but it's very pleasant. This is very nice. Next I'll be writing with my Platinum 3776 Diamond Black. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Again, platinum nibs, especially the fine and mediums, are known for having a little bit of feedback, but this is very pleasant. Just enough feedback to give you a little control on the page. And this Grape Ice Pop is a deceptively watery ink. It's so saturated, it looks like it might be one of those nice, viscous, opaque inks, but it's actually a pretty watery ink, and I found that those type of inks work very well in this platinum medium nib. So this one is also very nice. Next I've got a Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel cursive medium nib. Okay, I'm actually pretty surprised. This Pilot Pluminix has had a lot of trouble on every other writing sample that I've done up until this Tomoe River. On the Tomoe River, the ink is grabbing the paper and holding on to it and making a nice legible line, and it's very smooth. Next is a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. I wouldn't call this glassy smooth. It's more of a velvety smooth. There's a little bit of feedback, and I think that just has to do with this ink being so watery. There's just no viscous cushion of ink underneath the nib, but that speaks to how smooth of a nib this actually is. I want to try the reverse writing because this broad nib is the one that usually does very well reverse writing. It's not as smooth as it usually is. I feel a little bit of scratchiness. With most inks that I try, it writes like it was designed to write upside down like this. But I'm going to go ahead and make a note that with this ink, it does feel a little scratchy. But right side up, it is smooth. I'm going to put velvety. Very nice. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. Okay, and this one was glassy smooth. While that dries, let's take a look at the copy paper. The copy paper looks very nice. Several of the nibs, though, or two of the nibs, the Pluminix and the Sailor Pro Gear Slim, just felt kind of dry. The Conklin Mini Graph had a little trouble. There were some skips, and it felt okay for the most part, but it just felt like the ink was having trouble grabbing the paper. In fact, on the Pilot Pluminix, when I initially started writing, I felt like I was having trouble getting the ink to grab the paper. But the Platinum 3776 was my favorite by far. Since this was such a wet ink, it did bleed through the paper pretty severely, and with it being a dark ink, it really shows up. I did want to make a note that as I was writing, it didn't really feel like the ink was spreading out, and I guess that's because instead of spreading outward, it was just going straight through the paper. The letters look a little ragged on this bold nib, or on the broad nib, but I still feel like it looks pretty good. Sometimes when you write with an ink like this on copy paper and it comes across just flat and there's no shading or anything, it looks unpleasant, but there's something about this Grape Ice Pop that I really like it in the broad nib. I think it looks good. There aren't many inks in my collection that are comparable to Grape Ice Pop, but this is my favorite shade of purple. In fact, I just recently bought a little bottle of Herbin Poussière de Lune, and you can see they are very similar. Herbin Poussière de Lune had trouble grabbing onto the paper when I was trying to make the ink swatch, and you can see it didn't perform very well in the stub nibs. It just had trouble grabbing the paper. And with most of my ink samples, I had the same trouble with Ferris Wheel Press Ice Pop. On every writing sample that I did, except for the Tomoe River, the Pilot Pluminix was just horrible to write with. It didn't want to grab the paper. And even on the 1.5 stub nib, you can see on the downward strokes, they're just uneven. And on my ink swatch up here that I did with the tweezers, it just stopped and I had to pick up the tweezers and start again to get it to make the entire swatch. But you can see from the scribble that Grape Ice Pop is a little bit wetter. It came off the nib a little bit faster at first than the Poussière de Lune. The only other similar ink I had was Monteverde Burgundy. They're similar at first glance, but Burgundy is more red and Grape Ice Pop is more purple. Now I do have several purple inks in my collection, and recently I've done tests for Cross Violet, which I think is a beautiful ink. I love to look at it. And I think for signing cards and thank you notes and writing a letter, I would love to use this ink. But for taking notes and something that I'm going to go back and reread, I just really like this more subdued, darker, dustier looking purple. And that goes the same for Waterman Tender Purple. Roaring Klinger Cassia was an ink that I initially enjoyed using in my Conklin mini graph. But again, it's a darker purple, but it's still got that brightness to it that I get tired of it after a while. And Murasaki Shikibu was the first purple ink I ever purchased. I have one of the little 15-ounce bottles, and it's a pretty ink, but it's just pale and light. Again, I don't like it for notes. I prefer this raisin color purple. Ferris Wheel Press Grape Ice Pop has no water resistance. Okay, I'm curious to see what the back of this page looks like. No bleed through. We've got some show through, but usually, in my experience, inks that have a purple component to them are more likely to bleed through, and with this one being so dark and wet, I'm impressed, especially this really wet swatch. The Platinum 3776 is my favorite. I just love that medium nib with wetter inks. It just performs nicely. I also like the Kaweco. You just can't hardly go wrong with this Kaweco broad nib. It performs so well with basically every ink I've tried in it. The Sailor Pro Gear Slim is a little bit fine. It did well on this nice smooth Tomoe River paper, but on every other paper that I tried it with, it was just a little bit rough. The one thing that Herbin Poussière de Lune has going for it over this Ferris Wheel Press Grape Ice Pop is that you can get the smaller bottles. I really love those 10 milliliter bottles of Herbin inks. Ferris Wheel Press inks, usually you have to buy them in a pretty large quantity, so that's one thing to consider. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.